training as part of the Zero Suicide Systems Approach pilot project that we're currently engaged in. At this point, your base has completed several trainings that are associated with the ZSSA pilot, including screening and assessment training. But now we're going to start focusing on the treatment side of the house. And we're going to start with helping you kind of standardize your approach to helping patients manage their risk for suicide. I want to acknowledge that for a lot of you folks, this will be pretty similar. Aspects of this plan will be close to what you're already doing. What we're looking to do is just provide a standardized approach and a standardized template for you to work with your patients. For those of you that don't have that much experience with safety planning in general, this presentation will give you a good overview of what we're expecting as part of the pilot for the pilot safety planning tool, and I think you'll get a lot from this presentation. First thing we're going to do, if you haven't already done this, the evaluation sheet that was given to you by Captain Deathridge, in the upper right hand corner there's a code box that says ID code. What we're going to have you do is create an anonymous but unique identification code that can be used to track this information and your responses to this evaluation sheet. So we'll go ahead and get started with that. At the very top, we'd like you to put the first three letters of your base designation, so capital NEL dash, and then we'll start the 4-element identifier. The first element, we want you to write a 1 if you were born on an even year, or write a 2 if you were born on an odd year. Second element is to write the second letter of your mother's first name. Third element is to write the first letter of your birth month. And then finally, the one that'll make you count your fingers and your toes, writing the number that corresponds to the third letter of your first name. And once you're done with that, you'll see there at the bottom there's an example of what your identification code would look like, that capital NEL dash, and then the 4 elements associated with that. Once you've completed that ID code, what we'd like you to do is go ahead and fill out section 1. This is a pre-questionnaire before the actual presentation begins. So that very first page, if you could go ahead and complete that. When you're done, just kind of sound off in the chat comment box to let us know that we can continue.
Welcome.
Hello.
So for those of you just joining us, we're filling out the first section of the evaluation form that was passed out by Captain Deathridge. So if you want to go ahead and complete that, and then let us know in the chat box when you are finished.
No, it's okay.
Just let us know in the chat box. I told them to tell us when they're done in the chat box. Okay, just keep an eye on it. They're not using it. Knowledge.
Again, when you're done, if you could just quickly let us know by just saying done in chat, so we know we can move on. We have some time that we need to make up.
All right, folks, in the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and move forward. For those of you that are finishing up your part one of the evaluation, please continue to do so, and we'll go ahead and continue here. We're going to skip over even objectives as we're going through each of these elements anyways.
Excuse me, this is Dr. Stoughton. I can't get into it's been saying connecting to server for about 5 minutes.
Dr. Hamill, I'll go problem solve for her. We can move forward.
Okay, thank you. Just a tiny bit of background. Suicide in the Air Force is a health system problem or a health system issue. This is just a background information on calendar year 17. As you can see, through the 29th of September, the total force suicides and active duty Air Force suicides were on par with calendar year 15. So they are still rather high. They're not trending downward at this time. So this is still a peak of interest for this project. This is a copy of the safety planning tool that we're working with at this time. We'll go over this in a little bit more detail as we go through each individual step. But as you can see on this slide, there are 6 steps. They're graduated in terms of the level of intervention that is associated with each of them. And later on in the presentation, we will be going over each individual step. But first, we want to talk a little bit about why do we need to complete a safety plan. And really, when it comes down to it, it's about building knowledge of and increasing perceived self-efficacy in a patient's ability to use internal coping strategies and to utilize external coping resources to manage suicidal thoughts. And the ultimate goal being to decrease imminent risk and to decrease the intensity and duration of a suicidal crisis. Furthermore, what we tend to know, and we've talked to you folks about this several times, especially during the screening and assessment training, is that suicide risk tends to fluctuate over time. 30% of folks tend to report that a suicidal crisis happens for a duration shorter than an hour. Safety plan, when it comes down to it, is about getting them through that crisis, helping them to distract themselves and to bide their time so that they can receive any necessary intervention that needs to occur. So we're trying to target the urge to engage in suicidal thinking or fantasizing before it proceeds to actual suicidal behavior, towards acting out on that suicidal ideation. One of the main reasons this is an effective strategy is because it provides a tangible means, a tangible document that they can access to help cope with the fact that problem solving tends to diminish during a crisis. And with practice, this template can enhance their coping abilities.
So this slide sort of demonstrates a little bit about what Mike just said, and that is, for most people who are in a suicidal crisis, the crisis is going to last 4 minutes. As Mike said, about a third will be less than an hour, but for some it's significantly less, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. The idea is whatever a person's suicidal crisis timeline and intensity looks like, as you see in the top half of this chart, this is someone who gets no safety planning intervention. And as you can see, their arc of suicide risk gets pretty steep, gets pretty high, and the duration looks pretty long. In the bottom half of the chart, we see someone who's had a safety plan and engaged with the safety plan. And what you can see is, because they use these strategies and built some coping skills, their time in the suicide crisis is significantly less, and the intensity of that suicidal crisis is significantly less. And as a result of those two things, the likelihood of acting out becomes much less. So there are a couple of things we get out of having a safety plan. As we've already mentioned, it reduces suicide risk. There's evidence that safety planning, when people engage in it, are less likely to engage in suicidal behavior. They're less likely to die by suicide. And their self-report of the experience of going through a suicidal crisis is much less concerning. It enhances coping skills. It buys time. Again, we want to distract and delay people who are in a suicide crisis so that the likelihood of engaging in the behavior diminishes. And because people get more skillful at dealing with their suicidal crises, it reduces reliance on hospitalizations. Further, there's some evidence that people who are exposed to the crisis safety planning have an increased motivation for treatment. It helps them link to supportive resources, not only for suicidal crises, but other things they might be struggling with. And then because they can deal with the stress of difficult emotions, it can help build resilience for their actual treatment.
So a couple underlying communication points. As you're involved in this collaborative process with your patients, I want to have you just kind of think about this. The ultimate goal is to preserve the patient's life. That's the essential goal. With that is this idea that we want to try to end that emotional pain in a positive way, right? We know that a lot of folks that are thinking about suicide, it's a means to an end. But the safety plan provides a kind of an intermittent process or intermittent goal through which we can try to lower their emotional pain that they're experiencing during a time of crisis. We're looking to build those coping skills that can be identified. Those are through the identification of the warning signs, the first step we're going to go over, and using those effectively to reduce the duration and frequency of their crisis when it does occur. Patient and the provider are a team. They'll work together. This is a collaborative document, so we want to make sure that you're using this in collaboration with the patient. It can, of course, be modified as you go through your patient notes during subsequent encounters, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But it helps increase a sense of control for the patient. And as Keith had just previously mentioned, it can help to make therapy be perceived as more helpful and tolerable to the patient. So what is in a safety plan? Well, it's a prioritized written list of coping strategies and resources. It should be short, easy to read, in the patient's words. So we want to make sure that it's in the patient's own words, so that they can make sure that it's easy enough for them to utilize in a time of crisis.
And as we'll see in just a minute, these are often very simple and easy to do things. You know, again, when someone's in a crisis, we don't want to make things complicated for them. We want to make it easier. So these are not rocket science kinds of things, but they are effective when used.
Absolutely. So this is just an example of the post-screening safety planning protocol that you folks are already pretty familiar with. The only addition that's been made to these is a specific provision for what should be done in regards to safety planning. On the med group side, so BHOP and the wider MTF, you'll see there in red that for intermediate and low suicide risk patients, they'll be providing a patient with a pre-populated BSPT, so the Brief Safety Planning Tool card. And they'll be documenting the results of those cards within their own documentation procedures. The high suicide risk individuals, they'll still be immediately getting a full suicide assessment by either BHOP or mental health, and they will complete a full safety planning tool document as part of that assessment. On the mental health BHOP side, the only difference in this chart, you'll see there in red, is that we want to make sure that you folks are providing the patient with the card, of course, but also uploading a copy to HAMES for further review and for subsequent review. This slide just shows for the post-assessment safety planning protocol. So once somebody has been identified as high risk, they go through the formal suicide assessment process. They'll complete the full suicide safety planning tool or review or update an existing one as indicated if it's a subsequent high-risk screen. And as we said on the last two documents, on the last two triage charts, you just want to make sure we provide patients with that full SPT and upload a copy to HAMES. If for some reason a patient gets into a full assessment and they end up being classified as either intermediate or low risk after the fact, they'll follow the same procedures as these post-screening charts. So you'll just fill out the BSPT or review or update an existing one depending on the patient, and providing that BSPT and uploading a copy to HAMES. It's pretty clear cut.
Okay, we saw this chart a little bit earlier. One of the important things when working collaboratively with your patient and developing the safety plan is how you frame this. Because for a lot of patients, particularly those who have been chronically suicidal, they may not have any belief that they can do something like this. you often hear suicidal patients like, that's just the way I am. This is how I deal with things. So the framing of the safety plan is really important. I think talking about the person's suicidal arc, meaning the intensity of their suicidal crisis and the duration of the suicidal crisis, can be a good way to talk about it. And the fact that by using the safety plan, what we're trying to do is decrease the intensity and shorten the duration of the crisis. So it's a good way to discuss the rationale for the safety plan, and that communicating in your frame that building the plan together is important, and each safety plan is unique to each person. It is not a cookie cutter approach, because what you're saying to the patient is, we're going to use your ideas about what works for you or what has a high likelihood of working for you. And another way to frame is to say, look, by engaging in the safety plan, you're going to start to take some control over your thoughts and feelings. And over time, you'll learn how to handle difficult thoughts and feelings in a more sophisticated way. So we had about a 4-minute video here that of Dr. David Jobs, who's one of the leaders in the safety planning approach to suicide, and he talks about in this how he typically frames safety planning to his patients. And very briefly, I mean, essentially what he says to the patient is, look, suicide is a decision you can always make. The thing is, it's an eternal decision. It's a decision that lasts for an eternity. And what he asks patients to agree to typically, and by the way, this is just an approach to framing it. We're not suggesting you use this approach, but he has a pretty creative idea about how to do it, is, look, you can make that decision. You could be one of the 85 people who are going to die today by suicide on average, right? But what I'm asking for from you today, patient, is that you agree to work with me for several weeks on developing the safety plan first, and then using it over the next few weeks, because what we're going to show you is that you actually can come to have more control over these crises that you're experiencing. And in a way, he also sort of talks about, look, there's nothing to lose. You have everything potentially to gain. Again, because we're honest, he's honest with patients and saying, look, I know suicide is never off the table completely. At some point, you may decide to do that. It's asking for a few weeks to start, demonstrating to the patient that they can have some success and that this approach has evidence that it actually works. It's good for patients to hear that. And Dr. Jobs has talked a lot about people feel like this approach, patients feel it's a way to really communicate that he's empathic about how serious suicide is for them, and that they actually are the ultimate owners of whether they're going to die by suicide or not. So again, acknowledging the reality of that, but asking for a commitment of some time to learn how to do this, and communicating some hope that it actually works for a lot of people who are suicidal. So again, framing is important, and Stanley and Brown have some ideas. We don't need to go over a lot of these, but again, important points to make when you're making a safety plan with someone is that it's collaborative. We're going to do it together. It's unique. It's not cookie cutter. There are several steps we're going to take, probably going to take about half an hour for us to complete this, maybe less. And that you're getting this form. This form, as Mike said, is a tangible resource for you to refer to when you're feeling out of sorts. And then to quickly just talk about the components that are included in the plan. Now, as I mentioned a little while ago, there are going to be patients who really have never thought about this, and who are going to be actually quite skeptical that they can do this. And so we want to recognize that we're going to encounter patients who are resistant to the idea of starting to take some control over these crises. So you want to be ready to deal with patients who are resistant, and I know you're already doing that. So it's important when we're developing the safety plan to be patient with patients, to be empathic, and to reiterate the sense that this is collaborative. We want to acknowledge the struggles that they're having with suicidality. And as in the Job's approach, where look, the reality is if you want to kill yourself, you can. But yet here you are. And the fact that you're here with me in the office suggests that you may not think suicide is the best thing to do. As I mentioned before, you have a lot to gain, nothing to lose if you try this. But we can work on strategies that have been shown to be really helpful. So again, being patient and suggesting the ways that this approach can work for them. Again, in working with patients who are resistant, you may need to fall back on some of your motivational interviewing type skills. So that's asking, questions that help the patient develop their own rationale for why they should engage in developing the safety plan. So something brought you here today. Why is it? What is it? What is it? Why are you here with me today that we can do that might change how things are for you? I think what if questions or statements are really helpful in motivational interviewing. So how would it be for you if you could learn to manage suicidal thoughts and feelings? How would that improve your life? Right now you're fixated on suicide, but what if you could come to have a broader perspective? Again, it's letting them fill in a potential rationale for doing the intervention.
So we'll get into discussing the different steps that are associated with this. Just a broad overview here on this slide. Step one is about having them recognize their personal warning signs or when the plan should be used, when a crisis is going to occur. And then we'll go through the graduated steps 2 through 5 in terms of the amount of coping or the level of coping that they are involved in during a crisis. So step one does involve the recognition of warning signs. One of the easiest prompts for this that you can use, or one of the most standard prompts, is what do you experience when you start to think about suicide or feel extremely distressed? Now, we know that patients aren't always forthcoming with this, or they may not even be able to frame it properly. So one thing you can try is to have the patient articulate this in a different way. So asking about the last time they felt that way. So ask them from an emotional standpoint, how did you feel the last time that you experienced a suicidal crisis, and work from there?
And what preceded those feelings?
Absolutely. Different warning signs can reflect different processes. So they can be specific thoughts, specific images, the thought processes themselves. So in terms of thoughts starting to race, not being able to focus, ruminating on a specific thought or idea of dying. Mood, restlessness, irritability, annoyance, or specific behaviors even. Pacing around the apartment like a caged animal, or yelling at their children like a maniac. Any of these could be considered a warning sign, and should really be tailored to the patient's specific patterns. We're not going to go specifically through all these examples, but this is just what it potentially could look like when you fill out the form. Now we know on the standardized form there's 3 spaces. We don't want to tell you that you only have to do 3. We want you to get as much information from your patients as possible so that you can have as informed a process as you possibly can. But these are just examples that kind of span the spectrum from my computer tells me I'm worthless. So it goes from thoughts to images to behaviors. So just an example of that.
All right, so warning signs first.
Once you've identified warning signs, this is when you actually start looking at specific coping skills. First, we're going to focus on internal coping skills, so self-management strategies. These are things you can do on your own if you become suicidal again, so you're experiencing a crisis, to help yourself not act on those thoughts and urges. At this point, you're not trying to identify any social contacts, any professional contacts, anything like that. You're focused specifically on their internal coping mechanisms. These can involve all kinds of different things, like going for a walk, working in the garden, petting the dog. It's always important at this point specifically, and from here on out, to have a certain level of review in mind. So you want to make sure that as they're listing these examples, these self-management strategies, that they fit different contexts in terms of time, when they can use them, how they can use them, and if they're viable. So at the bottom of the slide, we have this kind of review statement. If you were to do one of these today when you get home, which would you use? How would you use it? The more information, the more specific you can make it, the more likely they are to utilize that in a time of crisis. Once again, these are just some examples. We provided the entire slide deck to Captain Dethridge, so if you want these specific examples from him, please just ask. Step 3 is a two-pronged approach. At this point, we're not focusing on internal strategies. These are external coping resources. However, they're not specific to a crisis or to discussing a crisis. At this point, we're looking for them to list or to come up with people and settings that can help them provide distraction. Now, social support can have a positive impact on people who are struggling. However, not all social supports work. We have to make sure that they are, once again, viable and that they're a healthy network connection. And the right social network can offer support and distract suicidal patients. However, we want to make sure that these are a little bit intertwined when they are contacting these folks. If it's not over the phone, if it's in person, we want to make sure that the social settings that they are meeting these folks in are safe and will help the person get outside of themselves. Some prompts that you can use to ask a patient about this or to ask about these contacts are, who do you enjoy socializing with? Who helps take your mind off your problems at least for a little while? We want to make sure that these patients list multiple contacts for the same exact reason we talked about those internal coping strategies. We want to make sure that they work across the environmental context and that there's multiple areas or multiple contexts they can rely upon. These are some examples of that. Once again, we're not going to go over them in detail, but they are available for you in the presentation handout. Social settings. In a suicidal crisis, internal states are chaotic, painful, and hopeless. So at this point, if the patient has gotten to this point, they are not able to rely upon their internal management strategies, so that they're dependent on trying to use this context, so social settings, to provide themselves with distraction. It's all about getting outside of one's internal life by going to a helpful setting. This should be some place that socialization naturally occurs. We want to make sure, as always, excludes places where booze or drugs or any other kind of negative influence it could impact their ability to cope. This includes, parks, places of worship, exercise classes, or gyms. We do want to make sure that when our patients list these, that they are places they can actually access. For instance, if they ask to go to the mall, if they experience a crisis outside of normal mall hours, you want to make sure that you have a backup. So there's always a backup to a backup. That's why we want multiple settings to be listed. Prompts you can use for this: is there a place you enjoy which will provide a distraction for your thoughts? You want to make that clear. At this point, we're just looking for a distracting environment. We're trying to bide time. That's the whole point of the safety plan, is to buy time to allow for the crisis to resolve itself. So where can you go where you'll have a chance to be around people in a safe place? We're emphasizing it is a safe place. And we want to ask specific details. What is it about that place that helps you feel better? And what will you do there? You go to the coffee shop, what are you doing at the coffee shop? What kind of coffee do you order? Anything like that you can make it more detailed, it's more likely that they will focus on that and utilize that resource when they're in that intensified state. Once again, these are some examples for that. We're not going to go over those specifically. So at this point, if the patient gets to step 4, we're asking them about specific contacts that can help them to talk to them about their crisis specifically. This can be family or friends. They can obviously be a great help in assisting in a suicidal crisis. However, they don't always have to be friends. They could be a close coworker or some other person in their life or social circle. We want to make sure that we're selective, and primarily we want to make sure that it's someone who can handle the patient in distress. We don't want to just spring this on somebody that may not be prepared for this. But we want to make sure that they are able to handle that distress. These are some specific examples of people, and we want to just point out that in each one of these, I know I didn't say this before, but they are in quotations because we're putting them in the patient's own words. So each one of these examples, you'll notice that it's really about making it fit to the patient. Step 5, at this point, a patient could not focus on their internal strategies, know their contacts, their social contacts, or their social settings are not managing their suicidal crisis. And at this point, we'd have them contact professionals or agencies. The actual form itself includes a prompt for clinic and clinician contact, urgent care or emergency department contact, and at least one crisis line contact. And prompts for these are pretty standard. Who are the mental health professionals we should ID to be on your safety plan? This may be even just an internal question that's going on in you as a provider or staff's head as you figure out who specifically they should be contacting, if they have a set provider or if it should be the provider on call, etc. And are there other healthcare providers you feel comfortable with? It's always important to take the person's feelings into context. If they have a specific contact in an emergency department or specific urgent care center, absolutely, if that would be a useful contact for them, include it. Once again, this is just an example of what it would look like filled out. Very brief, very straightforward. We want to make it as simple to follow as possible for that patient.
Okay, just to take 1 second to review a little bit of what we just talked about before we talk about getting control over lethal means. So again, the safety plan should be fairly straightforward. It should not be complicated. We start with our identification of what the warning signs are, and then we want to communicate to the patient that these are steps that you go through only if you need to go through them. Meaning, if you're starting with self-management strategies, going for a walk, going to the dog park, playing with your little nephew or cousin, whatever it is, if that gets them through the suicidal crisis at that particular time, they can stop there. The idea of the stepped approach is that we want them to try something first, see if it works for them. If it does, great. They've successfully executed their safety plan. But if not to despair, but to realize you can try then the next stepped up approach. So if self-management wasn't sufficient, now I can think about distraction with somebody else or going to a place that I really like. Let's see how that works. For some people, the suicidal crisis will end there. If it doesn't, we're telling them, look, okay, if that doesn't work, let's try the next step. And then the next step, and subsequently at the last step, going for professional help if that's how far they need to go to get control over this suicidal crisis. Again, the idea is we're helping the patient get some distraction, get some distance from their suicidal thinking, but also start to take a little bit of control, which many people when they're in a crisis situation don't feel they have. And by helping them gain a little bit of control, it's going to help them in terms of how they cope with the current situation as well as future situations that may arise. Any questions or comments, if you want to make them over the phone or if you want to just send them in, please do so before we switch gears. Any comments or questions on those who have access to a phone?
I have a quick question, sir. Is there any evidence indicating that having a physical, like paper or a card, actually makes a difference versus just discussing what's on this card?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's been a couple of different studies by Stanley and Brown, specifically within the emergency departments. They haven't gone past that, but looking at specifically giving them a paper copy. Patients have overwhelmingly reported that having that tangible document at hand helped them to focus. So just having that helped them to focus, and then being able to focus on that document and having those at hand really made a difference and actually increased their likelihood to seek professional treatment rather than attempting on their own life. So yes, there is documented evidence of that.
Great question. Others or comments? Okay.
I'm sorry. Just one other thing I want to add to that. One other positive aspect they found was handing someone that specific card actually increased perceptions that the person was cared for and that the specific provider that gave that to them or the staff member that gave that to them within that context specifically cause them to come back for further care. So it definitely provides a boost in terms of treatment fidelity.
Okay, great. Okay, so step 6. For folks who are in suicidal crises and have access to lethal means, we really need to be thoughtful about how to deal with that. As we mentioned earlier, suicide risk fluctuates over time, and the whole point of a safety plan is to help get them through it safely. But we know that the methods that people use to actually attempt to die or actually complete a suicide depends a lot on how available that particular method is to them. We also know that fatality ratios vary by methods. Some methods are more deadly than others. For example, gunshot wounds are the most deadly versus wounds from cutting or the use of pills to attempt an overdose. We also want to control means because we know the vast majority of folks who are feeling suicidal feel quite ambivalent about it. Typically when you talk to patients who are feeling suicidal, as you already know, they can talk about a part of them that wants to die and a part of them that wants to live. We have a window of opportunity, again, if we can put some time and distance and distraction, as well as control over means that they can use to kill themselves, we have a greater chance of capitalizing on those feelings of ambivalence. Another reason why we want to control lethal means is that we know that 90% of people who actually attempt to kill themselves but survive will not ultimately die by suicide. So what do we know? We know that the people who attempt and survive are typically not using the most lethal means. They're not using guns. They're more likely to cut or use pills, things of that nature. So if anything we can do that helps them not go to the more lethal means, that person over the rest of their lives has a much higher chance of not dying by suicide. So we know that most suicides are completed using firearms than all the other methods combined. So that's why we really want to start with guns. We also know that the fatality ratio for folks who attempt by guns is 85% to 90%, meaning 85% to 90% of people who attempt using guns are going to die. A large proportion who live are going to have significant physical and or mental injury. And so we can contrast that 85 to 90% fatality ratio, for example, with medications, which is much, much lower, less than 5%. So the inherent deadliness of guns is pretty obvious, and that's why we were going to start talking about guns specifically. They're the most lethal method, and they are accessible. Clearly in the military, people are comfortable with guns. They have no problem using guns. They're not scared of guns. So there's lots of acceptability in terms of guns and lots of access. So in terms of safety planning, we always want to ask a patient about whether they have access to both military-issued firearms and private firearms. There's a high number of folks in the military who do have private firearms, and it can be, as you already know, a very sensitive and emotional issue when you start talking about getting some temporary control over firearms. But you want to not only ask about guns specifically, but you also want to ask about any other means that they are considering. And we know in the Air Force, for example, that behind guns as the leading cause of death and suicide is hanging. So that's one that you probably want to ask about too. If someone describes a low lethality method in terms of controlling the lethal means, like I'm thinking of taking a few Tylenol, I think in that case, it's good to just say, look, let's just you go home and get rid of your Tylenol, or keep 2 Tylenol and give the bottle to your neighbor, and trust that that's going to be sufficient for them to do. But when we start talking about the more lethal means, we really need to collaborate with the patient about how they can execute a means restriction plan that will work. And so the other way we want to do this in most cases is we probably want to get at least one other person involved who the patient trusts and knows who could actually help in a crisis situation. It could be a family member or a friend or someone in authority. But the idea is we probably are not going to feel comfortable with someone who's in a suicidal crisis to get the control over their over access to their gun, let's say, or whatever other lethal means they're talking about. But in most cases, it's going to be a gun. That we're not going to necessarily have a lot of faith that left to their own devices, they're going to be able to do that. So that's why we want to have a third person. There's yourself, there's the patient, and then a collaborator who can help execute the plan. And just as importantly as executing it, actually can help us confirm that the plan was executed. In other words, when we're making a plan to reduce lethal means, we want to have a way to get some confirmation that the plan has actually taken place. One other thing, particularly important in the military context, is when we're talking about gaining some control over lethal means or helping the patient gain control over lethal means, we want to stress that this is temporary. This is not a Second Amendment issue. You absolutely have the right to your gun. You're going to get your gun back. This is temporary. We need to sort of ride through this crisis as safely as we can. So just always reminding them this is a temporary safety plan. This is a temporary solution. And we just don't want you to have the possibility of accessing something in a moment of impulse that could end your life. So this is sort of what it looks like on the form. Again, you're asking about military issued firearms. You're asking about non-military firearms. We're talking about removal of both the weapon itself as well as ammunition, if we can. Ideally, we want to get rid of both. And also then medications. We always want to ask about, do they have medications that could be considered dangerous or lethal? And then the plan for what's going to be done with those. And then others. Again, I mentioned hanging is the second leading cause of death by suicide in the Air Force. So we probably want to inquire about that as well. But whatever the patient mentions, they could mention knives or razors or whatever they're most serious about and is most lethal, we really want to get some control over those to the extent that we can. I want to stop just for 1 second, and I know we're kind of short on time, but this is one where I think hearing from folks who've actually dealt with this could be really helpful. Can anyone, if they're willing, just talk a little bit about their experience in negotiating a safety plan around lethal means, guns or pills or whatever? And what that negotiation was like, and whether you used a third person to sort of help affect this?
Sir?
Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Dillner, I work in BHOP over at the hospital.
Thank you, ma'am.
And there have been times where I've had to reassure the active duty member that the first shirt will have their weapon, but it will be put in an armory and it will be returned.
Yep.
And then with patients that are not active duty, but perhaps have a parent there, but the parent's resistant to their child being taken to the hospital for evaluation or whatever, I found that it's really more likely to happen if I walk them to the ER.
Yeah.
Because parents leave and the the child will talk them out of it.
That's a great point. I think all those things that show the extra concern, empathy, and support are really important to people who are really kind of spiraling and spinning into a crisis, as well as you mentioned their families as well. It's extraordinarily stressful for families to deal with for kids who are feeling suicidal. But I like that notion again. It's temporary. You know, the first shirt's going to take your military issued. It's going to be in an armory. You'll get it back when, you know, whatever conditions of their safety are met. Anyone else who's negotiated some of this?
Well, I have another thing that happened that was a little different.
Perfect.
The patient was willing to text her husband because she couldn't get a hold of him. And then she was willing to wait until we heard from him and I was able to actually talk with him. And it just gave a reassurance that it was actually going to be carried out.
Perfect. And I think one of the things, if you can do it, and maybe you did it in this case, is just, I don't know if you then had a subsequent call or text with the husband just to say, hey, you know, whatever their plan was to lock it up or take the key or give it to a neighbor, that it actually happened.
Yes, I always do that.
Okay, fantastic. Perfect. Thank you for those examples. Those are really helpful. Okay, so as we just heard, it's great. You have your designated helper. You execute, you lay out the plan clearly, simply as possible. Keep the instructions clear, and then confirm that the plan actually happened. So this is perfect. Thank you. And then returning means once certain conditions are met, and we know that, for example, I think in a lot of cases, if someone's on the Hill, they need to be off it for some number of weeks before before their handgun, for example, can be returned. But whatever the preconditions are, once they're met, the return of the means is perfectly fine.
So folks, that was the full safety planning tool. As we discussed earlier, that would be the complete tool that is done with folks that are at high risk for suicide, post-assessment, and then at follow-up. Just some critical implementation factors during the review process. Once you've completed the plan, you want to make sure that you go over it with your patient to make sure that they're aware of where they're going to keep the plan. How you want to ask them how likely it is that they will use the safety plan when they notice their warning signs. You also want to make sure that you're asking about any barriers that may serve to get in the way of them using either their internal or external coping resources. And you want to make sure that you help patients find ways to get past those barriers. And if there isn't a good way to get past that barrier, to identify an alternative that can be put in its place. And you want to make sure that for that patient, that because it is a tangible, concrete resource for them, you want to make sure that it's easily accessible readily accessible and easy to use. We also want to make sure that we review and revise the safety plan at each contact. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to go through the entire process again with the patient. If it's part of their active, suicidal arc or suicidal risk arc, this could involve something as simple as reviewing your case notes after an encounter to update any of their social contacts. For instance, if they have a significant other that they've had a recent falling out with, that person may not necessarily be the best person to be on their social contact list in either step 3 or step 4. So reviewing that as you go through your case notes is a definite initiative here. We want to remind that the plan is not a static document. It's not meant to be a standalone document. Environment change, instances change, circumstances change. We want to make sure that it's the most up-to-date document as possible for that patient so that it can be utilized by them. So we want to revise as circumstances and needs change over time, including those contacts that we just mentioned. I want to briefly talk a little bit about the BSPT. I know we'd mentioned this at the beginning as part of those screening triage charts. The BSPT is an index card size template that includes a single step on each side. On the front side of the card will be personal contacts. So it's equivalent to step 4 in the full safety plan, where you're asking a patient to list people who they can talk to help during a crisis. This is a bit more brief than the full plan, but this is the collaborative portion of the BSPT. They're expecting staff to collaborate with the patient before they leave the clinic on their encounter. On the back of the card will be a pre-populated professional contact list that can be used during a crisis. The actual contacts that are listed, these cards were developed in collaboration with Captain Deathridge, and he'll be reviewing those specific contacts and the method and procedures for listing those pre-populated contacts with you folks after the conclusion of this training. If I can get it to advance. There we go. All right. So this is just an example of what the brief safety planning front of the tool looks like. As we said, it's listing your contacts, or your social contacts that they can utilize during an actual crisis to talk specifically about a crisis. And then the back of the card, as we said, is professional or agencies